The morning sun beat down mercilessly on Fort Campbell, Kentucky, as Drill Sergeant Marcus Iron Rodriguez watched the new batch of recruits stumble through their morning formation. 22 years in the Army had taught him to spot trouble from a mile away, and Private Jake Morrison was practically broadcasting it with his slouched shoulders and defiant smirk. Rodriguez had seen thousands of young men and women pass through basic training. Some came in ready to serve, others needed molding, and a few required breaking down completely before they could be rebuilt into soldiers. Morrison fell into that third category, and Rodriguez could smell the attitude on him like cheap cologne. The recruit stood in the back row, deliberately half a step out of formation. His uniform was regulation, but something about the way he wore it screamed disrespect. Maybe it was the slight tilt of his cap or the way his hands hung loose at his sides instead of crisped at attention. Rodriguez had dealt with wise guys before, but Morrison had a particular brand of arrogance that set his teeth on edge. "Morrison!" Rodriguez barked, his voice cutting through the humid Kentucky air like a blade. "Front end, center." The young man sauntered forward with deliberate slowness, his eyes scanning the other recruits as if looking for an audience. At 19, Jake Morrison stood 6 feet tall with the kind of lean muscle that came from high school athletics rather than real work. His sandy brown hair was regulation length, but Rodriguez noticed he kept touching it, still adjusting to the military cut. Morrison had arrived at Fort Campbell 3 weeks earlier with a file that told Rodriguez everything he needed to know. Son of a wealthy defense contractor, kicked out of 2 prep schools, arrested twice for drunk driving before his 18th birthday. The kid had never faced real consequences in his life, and his father had apparently decided the Army would straighten him out where expensive schools and family money had failed. "You got something to say, Morrison?" Rodriguez asked, stepping close enough to see the flecks of gold in the recruit's brown eyes. Those eyes held no fear, no respect, just cool calculation. Morrison was sizing him up like he sized up everything else in his privileged life. "No, Drill Sergeant," Morrison replied, but his tone carried just enough insolence to dance on the edge of insubordination. It was a practiced move, Rodriguez realized. The kid knew exactly how far he could push without crossing lines that would bring serious consequences. The other recruits watched nervously. They had learned to fear Rodriguez's explosive temper during their first week of training. He was known for creative punishments that left lasting impressions without crossing into abuse. But Morrison seemed immune to intimidation, which only made Rodriguez more determined to find the young man's breaking point. Private Lisa Chen stood in formation trying not to stare at the confrontation unfolding before her. She had joined the Army to prove herself after growing up in her overprotective parents' shadow in San Francisco. At 22, she was older than most recruits and had noticed Morrison's behavior from day one. Unlike the others, she wasn't intimidated by his confidence. She recognized it for what it was, a mask hiding deep insecurity. Chen had watched Morrison struggle with tasks that required teamwork or following orders without question. During obstacle course training, he would take unnecessary risks to show off rather than complete objectives efficiently. In classroom sessions, he would make subtle jokes that undermined instructors without being obviously disrespectful. It was death by 1,000 cuts, and Chen could see it wearing on the drill sergeants. Beside Chen, Private Tommy Williams shifted uncomfortably. Williams had grown up poor in rural Alabama and saw military service as his ticket to a better life. Morrison's casual disregard for an opportunity Williams would kill for made his blood boil. But Williams was smart enough to keep his mouth shut and his observations to himself. Rodriguez stepped back and addressed the entire formation. "Today we're doing combat scenario training in the woods. You'll work in teams of 4 to complete a series of objectives while under simulated enemy fire." His eyes found Morrison again. "This isn't a game. The skills you learn today might save your life or the life of the soldier next to you in real combat." The drill sergeant began dividing recruits into teams, carefully balancing personalities and skill levels. Morrison ended up paired with Chen, Williams, and Private David Kumar, a quiet computer science major from Minnesota who had joined to pay for college. Rodriguez made the assignment deliberately, knowing Chen's maturity and Williams's dedication might help contain Morrison's ego. As the teams prepared their gear, Morrison immediately tried to assert leadership. "All right, listen up. he announced to his teammates. "I've been hunting since I was 12, so I know these woods better than any of you. We follow my lead, we'll finish first." Chen raised an eyebrow. "Have you been hunting in these specific woods, Morrison? Because I'm pretty sure you're from Connecticut." Morrison's jaw tightened slightly. "Woods are woods, Chen. Some of us have actually been in the field before instead of just reading about it in books." Kumar looked uncomfortable with the tension already building in their group. Williams just shook his head and continued checking his equipment. They hadn't even started the exercise, and Morrison was already creating division in the team. Rodriguez watched the interaction from a distance, making mental notes. Morrison's need to dominate was predictable, but the way he dismissed Chen's valid question showed a deeper problem. The recruit didn't just lack respect for authority, he lacked respect for competence that didn't come from his own narrow experience. The training scenario was designed to test more than tactical skills. Hidden throughout the course were situations requiring split-second decisions about rules of engagement, civilian casualties, and resource allocation. Rodriguez had developed these scenarios based on real situations from his deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. They weren't just academic exercises, they were previews of the moral complexities recruits would face in actual combat. 20 minutes into the exercise, Morrison's team was making good time but struggling with cohesion. Morrison insisted on point position despite Kumar's superior map reading skills and Chen's better marksmanship scores. When they encountered their first scenario, a simulated checkpoint with civilian and military targets, Morrison made a hasty decision that would have resulted in friendly fire casualties. "Wrong," shouted the instructor monitoring their station. "You just killed 2 Allied soldiers because you didn't identify targets properly. Your team is down 2 members." Morrison's face flushed red. "That's garbage. In real combat, you don't have time to win real combat, you don't have time to make stupid mistakes either," Chen interrupted. "Maybe if you had listened to Kumar's intel briefing instead of assuming you knew better, you would have known friendlies were in the area." The exchange escalated quickly. Morrison stepped closer to Chen, using his height advantage in an attempt to intimidate her. "You want to question my judgment? When's the last time you actually fired a weapon at something that wasn't a paper target?" Williams finally spoke up. "When's the last time you followed orders without adding your own commentary, Morrison?" The argument continued until their instructor ordered them to move to the next station. But the damage was done. What should have been a team exercise had become a power struggle with Morrison at the center. Rodriguez observed from the control point, watching his problem recruit dig himself deeper into a hole. At the next station, the scenario involved evacuating wounded soldiers under enemy fire. The exercise required careful coordination and absolute trust in teammates. Morrison immediately began issuing orders, but his previous performance had eroded his team's confidence. When Chen suggested an alternative approach based on medical training she had received before enlisting, Morrison shot her down dismissively. "We don't have time for your textbook theories," Morrison snapped. "In the real world, you have to make quick decisions." "In the real world, you have to make smart decisions," Kumar said quietly. It was the first time the usually silent recruit had directly challenged Morrison, and it clearly rattled the would-be leader. The team's performance continued to deteriorate as Morrison's authoritarian approach clashed with the cooperative skills the exercise was designed to develop. By the 4th station, his teammates were openly ignoring his commands and working around him rather than with him. Rodriguez had seen enough. He activated his radio and called all teams back to base camp for what he announced as a tactical review session. In reality, he was planning a confrontation that had been building for 3 weeks. Morrison's behavior was affecting not just his own performance but the morale and effectiveness of his entire training unit. The recruits gathered in a semicircle around Rodriguez, their faces muddy and sweating from the morning's exercises. Morrison sat slightly apart from his teammates, his posture defensive but still defiant. Rodriguez began by reviewing the morning's performance, highlighting both successes and failures across all teams. "Combat isn't a video game," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying clearly in the afternoon air. "Your decisions have consequences that go beyond your own survival. The soldier next to you is depending on you to be smart, disciplined, and selfless. His eyes found Morrison. Some of you still think this is about proving how tough you are individually. Morrison shifted uncomfortably but maintained eye contact with the drill sergeant. The other recruits sensed tension building and unconsciously leaned forward, anticipating fireworks. Morrison, Rodriguez called out. "Stand up and tell me what you learned from today's exercise." The young man rose slowly, his jaw set in familiar stubborn lines. "I learned that some people aren't ready to make hard decisions under pressure, drill sergeant." A collective intake of breath ran through the gathered recruits. Morrison had just publicly criticized his teammates while deflecting responsibility for his own failures. It was a bold move that demonstrated either incredible confidence or stunning stupidity. Rodriguez felt his temper flare but kept his voice level. "Is that right? And what hard decisions did you make today, Morrison?" "I took charge when leadership was needed, drill sergeant. I made tactical decisions based on my experience." "Your experience hunting deer in Connecticut?" Rodriguez's voice carried a dangerous edge now. "Tell me, Morrison, in all that vast experience, did you ever learn that a good leader listens to his team?" Morrison's confident facade cracked slightly. "Sometimes leaders have to make unpopular decisions, drill sergeant. And sometimes leaders have to admit when they're wrong." Rodriguez stepped closer. "Can you admit when you're wrong, Morrison?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Morrison's face cycled through several expressions: anger, confusion, calculation. Finally, he settled on defiance. "I don't think I was wrong today, drill sergeant." It was the answer Rodriguez had expected, and the one that sealed Morrison's fate. The drill sergeant had been planning this moment since reviewing Morrison's file on his first day. Some recruits needed encouragement, others needed discipline. Morrison needed to be broken down completely before he could be rebuilt into a soldier. Rodriguez turned to address the entire group. "The most dangerous soldier in combat isn't the enemy you can see. It's the teammate who thinks he knows better than everyone else, who puts his ego ahead of the mission." His eyes never left Morrison. "That soldier will get you killed." The words hit Morrison like physical blows. For the first time since arriving at Fort Campbell, uncertainty flickered across his features. But, instead of backing down, he doubled down on his position. "Drill sergeant, I've been successful my whole life by trusting my own judgment. I'm not going to apologize for having confidence in my abilities." Rodriguez nodded slowly, as if Morrison had just confirmed something he suspected. "Successful at what, Morrison? Getting kicked out of prep school? Drunk driving? Having daddy bail you out when things get tough?" The other recruits watched in fascinated horror as Rodriguez dismantled Morrison's carefully constructed self-image piece by piece. Chen found herself feeling almost sorry for Morrison, despite his arrogant behavior. Williams felt vindicated but uncomfortable with the public humiliation. Kumar just wished he was somewhere else. Morrison's face had gone pale under his tan, but he maintained his defiant posture. "My personal life before the army isn't relevant to my performance here, drill sergeant." "Isn't it?" Rodriguez smiled coldly. "Because I see the same pattern here that I see in your file. When things don't go your way, you blame everyone else. When people don't follow your lead, you assume they're the problem." He paused for effect. "When's the last time you considered that maybe, just maybe, you might be wrong?" The question struck home because Morrison couldn't answer it honestly. His entire life had been structured to avoid that kind of self-reflection. Expensive schools had accommodated his behavior, family money had smoothed over his mistakes, and social connections had opened doors regardless of his performance. The army was the first environment where none of those advantages applied. Rodriguez could see the internal struggle playing out on Morrison's face. Part of the young man was beginning to understand the magnitude of his problems, but his pride wouldn't let him admit it publicly. The drill sergeant knew this was the critical moment: push too hard and Morrison might break in the wrong way; don't push hard enough and the lesson would be lost. "Morrison," Rodriguez said quietly, "I'm going to ask you one more time. What did you learn today?" Morrison stood frozen, his mind racing through possible responses. He could feel every eye on him, waiting for his answer. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, then painful. Finally, Morrison spoke. "I learned that I have a lot more to learn, Drill Sergeant." It wasn't the complete capitulation Rodriguez had hoped for, but it was a crack in Morrison's armor. The drill sergeant nodded curtly. "That's a start. We'll see how much you're actually willing to learn." He turned to address the group. "Fallout for evening chow. Team leaders report to my office at 2100 hours." As the recruits dispersed, Morrison remained standing for a moment, looking lost. The afternoon's events had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. For the first time in his life, his usual strategies weren't working. He couldn't charm his way out of this situation, couldn't buy his way past the obstacles, and couldn't intimidate people into following his lead. Chen approached him hesitantly. Despite their earlier conflict, she recognized someone struggling with challenges beyond their experience. "Morrison," she said quietly, "you don't have to prove anything to us. We're all trying to figure this out together." Morrison looked at her with surprise. After the way he had treated her during the exercise, he hadn't expected kindness. "Thanks," he said awkwardly. "I guess I'm not used to working with people who actually know what they're talking about." It was a small admission, but Chen recognized it as significant progress. "None of us really know what we're talking about yet," she replied. "That's why we're here learning." As they walked toward the mess hall, Morrison found himself reconsidering his approach to military training. The methods that had worked in civilian life, aggressive confidence, quick decisions, and personal charisma, seemed not just ineffective but counterproductive in this environment. He was beginning to understand that becoming a soldier would require fundamentally changing how he thought about leadership, teamwork, and himself. Rodriguez watched the interaction from his office window, making notes in Morrison's training file. The confrontation had accomplished its purpose. Morrison was finally questioning his assumptions. But the real test would come in the following weeks, as the recruit either embraced the opportunity to grow or retreated further into defensive arrogance. The evening air carried sounds of recruits settling into their barracks routine, muted conversations, the scratch of pencils on paper as some caught up on required reading, the occasional laugh as tension from the day's training dissolved into camaraderie. Morrison listened to these sounds as he prepared for lights out, realizing for the first time how isolated his behavior had made him from the community forming around him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove he could change. Rodriguez had given him a choice: continue on the path that led to failure and discharge, or begin the difficult process of becoming a soldier. As Morrison lay in his narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, he finally began to understand the magnitude of the decision before him. The next morning brought unseasonable heat to Fort Campbell, with humidity so thick it felt like breathing through wet cotton. Morrison woke before reveille, his mind still processing the previous day's events. Sleep had come fitfully, interrupted by dreams where he relived the confrontation with Rodriguez, searching for responses he wished he had given. The barracks around him hummed with the quiet sounds of soldiers preparing for another day of training. Morrison had always been an early riser, but today he found himself paying attention to his fellow recruits in ways he never had before. Williams was already up, quietly polishing his boots to mirror brightness. Kumar sat on the edge of his bunk, reviewing notes from yesterday's tactical session. Chen was stretching, preparing her body for the physical demands ahead. For 3 weeks, Morrison had seen these people as background characters in his own story. Today, watching them prepare with quiet professionalism, he began to realize he might have been the background character in theirs. Rodriguez appeared in the barracks doorway exactly at reveille, his presence immediately commanding attention without a word. The drill sergeant's eyes swept the room, taking in each recruit's level of preparation. When his gaze met Morrison's, there was no acknowledgement of yesterday's confrontation, just professional assessment. "Fall in for morning formation," Rodriguez called out. "Today we begin advanced team tactical training. Yesterday's performance showed me some of you need remedial work and basic cooperation before you can handle more complex operations." Morrison felt heat rise in his cheeks but said nothing. He had spent the sleepless hours of the night rehearsing apologies and explanations, but, standing at attention in the morning formation, he realized words would mean nothing. Rodriguez was a man who measured character through actions, not speeches. The morning's training began with a seemingly simple exercise, moving a series of heavy equipment boxes from one end of the training field to another while negotiating various obstacles. The catch was that each box required 4 people to lift safely, and the teams would rotate every 15 minutes. It was designed to force cooperation between recruits who might not naturally work well together. Morrison found himself initially paired with 3 recruits he had barely spoken to during his time at Fort Campbell. Private Roberts was a former factory worker from Michigan who had joined the Army after his plant closed. Private Washington was a college graduate from Atlanta who had enlisted to pay off student loans. Private Jones was 19 years old and, straight off a farm in Nebraska, joining the military to see the world beyond his small hometown. As they approached their first equipment box, Morrison's instinct was to start issuing orders. But, the memory of yesterday's failure made him hesitate. Instead, he listened as Roberts, who had actual experience moving heavy machinery, suggested the most efficient lifting technique. "Morrison and Washington take the front corners," Roberts said, his voice carrying natural authority earned through experience rather than assumed through privilege. "Jones and I will take the back. Remember to lift with your legs, and keep communication open about obstacles." It was a small thing, but Morrison followed Roberts's lead without argument. The box moved smoothly from point A to point B, and, when they set it down, Morrison felt something he hadn't experienced in weeks: the satisfaction of successful teamwork. Rodriguez watched this interaction from his observation post, noting Morrison's unusual cooperation in the recruits file. One day of good behavior didn't erase 3 weeks of problems, but it was a data point worth tracking. The rotation system meant Morrison worked with different groups throughout the morning. Each team presented new challenges and different leadership styles. When he was paired with Chen's group, she approached team organization with methodical precision, breaking down tasks into logical steps and ensuring everyone understood their role before beginning. "Morrison," she said after explaining the overall strategy, "you mentioned yesterday that you have hunting experience. Can you read the terrain ahead and identify the safest path for carrying something this heavy?" It was the first time anyone had asked Morrison to contribute his actual expertise rather than simply follow orders or provide muscle. The question caught him off guard, but he studied the field ahead seriously, looking for stable ground, potential hazards, and efficient routes. "There," he said, pointing to a path that avoided soft ground and low-hanging branches. "We can move faster and safer if we go around that muddy patch rather than trying to power through it." Chen nodded approvingly. "Good eye. Let us through it." The acknowledgement felt better than any praise Morrison had received in his privileged civilian life. It was earned through competence rather than given through family connections or social expectations. As he guided the team through the terrain he had identified, Morrison began to understand the difference between leadership and dominance. By mid-morning, the rotating team exercise had shown Rodriguez something interesting about group dynamics. Morrison performed well when given specific roles that matched his actual abilities, but struggled when he tried to assume overall command. More importantly, other recruits were beginning to see Morrison as potentially valuable teammate rather than an obstacle to overcome. Williams, who had been openly skeptical of Morrison's value to their unit, found himself paired with the former prep school student during the final rotation. Williams had expected attitude and resistance, but Morrison approached the task with focused determination. "Williams," Morrison said as they prepared to lift their assigned equipment, "you've been doing this longer than me. What's the best technique for the uneven ground ahead?" The question surprised Williams. Morrison was actually asking for guidance rather than assuming he knew better. Williams found himself explaining weight distribution and foot placement, knowledge gained through hard experience that Morrison absorbed without the defensive attitude he had shown previously. "You're stronger than you look," Williams said as they successfully navigated a particularly tricky obstacle. "And you actually listen when someone knows what they're talking about." Morrison almost smiled. "I'm learning that listening might be more important than talking." "Might be," Williams agreed. "Might be." When the morning exercise concluded, Rodriguez gathered all the recruits for debriefing. Instead of the individual criticism that had marked previous training sessions, he focused on group performance and lessons learned through cooperation. "Today I saw improvement in team cohesion," Rodriguez announced. "Some of you are beginning to understand that your individual success depends entirely on your unit's collective success." His eyes found Morrison briefly. "Others are beginning to understand that leadership means serving your team, not commanding it." Morrison felt the observation like a physical weight. Rodriguez wasn't praising him, but he wasn't singling him out for criticism either. It was professional assessment, and Morrison found himself grateful for the neutrality. After lunch, the afternoon brought weapons training, not the basic marksmanship they had been practicing for weeks, but tactical shooting scenarios that required coordination between shooters and spotters. Morrison had always been confident with firearms, but this training demanded skills beyond individual accuracy. Paired with Kumar as his spotter, Morrison found himself in unfamiliar territory. Kumar's quiet intensity and analytical mind made him exceptionally good at reading wind conditions, calculating range adjustments, and identifying targets through camouflage. But Kumar's natural introversion meant Morrison had to draw out the information rather than simply receive orders. "What do you see at 2 o'clock?" Morrison asked, scanning through his rifle scope. "Movement behind the large oak tree," Kumar replied quietly. "Range approximately 200 meters. Wind is pushing left to right at maybe 5 miles per hour." Morrison made the adjustments Kumar suggested and found his accuracy dramatically improved. When they switched roles and Kumar took the rifle, Morrison discovered that being an effective spotter required different skills than he had developed hunting alone in Connecticut woods. "Target acquired," Kumar whispered. "Range?" Morrison studied the terrain, using techniques Rodriguez had taught them for estimating distance without electronic aids. "I make it 250 meters, maybe 260. "Check again," Kumar said patiently. "Look at the size relationship between the target and the reference objects we identified earlier." Morrison looked again, more carefully this time. Kumar was right, his initial estimate had been off by nearly 50 meters, enough to cause a completeness in real combat conditions. The realization was humbling but educational. "You're right," Morrison said. "Thanks for the correction." "No problem," Kumar replied. "That's what spotters are for." The afternoon continued with increasingly complex scenarios designed to build trust between shooting partners. Morrison found himself relying on Kumar's analytical skills while Kumar benefited from Morrison's quick reflexes and decisive movement. It was the kind of symbiotic relationship that effective military units required, but Morrison had never experienced anything like it in his competitive civilian environment. Rodriguez observed these partnerships forming with professional satisfaction. Building effective two-man teams was crucial preparation for the larger unit cohesion that would be tested in the final weeks of basic training. Morrison's progress was noteworthy not because he was excelling, but because he was finally participating constructively in the learning process. As the training day wound down, Morrison found himself assigned to evening cleanup duties with a rotating group of recruits. In his first weeks, he had approached such assignments with barely concealed resentment, seeing manual labor as beneath his station. Tonight, working alongside Chen and 2 other recruits to maintain their equipment, he found unexpected satisfaction in the simple competence required for proper maintenance. "Morrison," Chen said as they cleaned their rifles together. "Can I ask you something?" Morrison looked up from the weapon he was disassembling. "Sure. What made you join the army?" "Really, I mean." Not the official answer, but the real reason. It was a question Morrison had avoided thinking about seriously since arriving at Fort Campbell. His usual response was something vague about serving his country, but sitting in the quiet evening atmosphere, surrounded by people who had shown him more respect in one day than he had earned in 3 weeks, he found himself wanting to give an honest answer. "I think I was running away from my life," Morrison said slowly. "Everything was set up for me: college, career, future wife from the right family. I felt like I was going to suffocate if I didn't do something that was actually mine." Chen nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense. But are you running toward something, or just away from your old life?" Morrison paused in his cleaning routine, really considering the question. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "I thought I was running toward proving myself, but I'm starting to think maybe I need to figure out who I actually am before I can prove anything to anybody." "That's probably the most honest thing you've said since you got here," Chen said with a small smile. Morrison laughed, surprising himself. "Yeah, well, honesty seems to work better here than bullshit." "Who knew?" Their conversation was interrupted by Williams joining the group with his own equipment to clean. Instead of the tension that had marked their previous interactions, Williams settled into the work with casual acceptance of Morrison's presence. "How'd you do with Kumar today?" Williams asked Morrison. "That boy's got a good eye for details." "Better than I expected," Morrison admitted. "He caught mistakes I didn't even know I was making. Made me realize I might not know as much about shooting as I thought I did." Williams raised an eyebrow. "That's got to be hard to hear for someone used to being good at everything." Morrison considered this. "Actually, it's kind of a relief. Being the person who's supposed to have all the answers is exhausting. It's nice to be able to learn from people who actually know what they're doing." It was another small admission, but Williams recognized its significance. Morrison was beginning to shed the defensive arrogance that had made him so difficult to work with. It didn't erase 3 weeks of problematic behavior, but it suggested the possibility of real change. As evening settled over Fort Campbell, Morrison found himself in an unfamiliar but pleasant situation, sitting with a group of fellow recruits, engaged in normal conversation without underlying tension or power struggles. They talked about their backgrounds, their goals, their fears about upcoming advanced training phases. Morrison learned that Roberts had a wife and 2 young children he was supporting through his military service. Washington had been a philosophy major who joined the Army because he wanted to test his abstract theories against real-world challenges. Jones had never been more than 50 miles from his family farm before shipping to basic training. Each story reminded Morrison how narrow his own experience had been before joining the Army. These people had faced real challenges, made real sacrifices, and developed real strength through adversity. His own problems, expensive school expulsions and family disappointment seemed trivial in comparison. "What about you, Morrison?" Roberts asked. "Got any family back home worried about you?" Morrison thought about his parents, probably sitting in their Connecticut mansion, telling their country club friends about their son's military service as if it were another expensive character-building exercise. "They're not worried," he said honestly. "They think this is just another phase I'm going through before I come back and take over part of the family business." "Are they right?" Washington asked. Morrison was quiet for a long moment. A week ago, he would have said yes, the Army was just a detour before returning to his predetermined path. But, sitting in the barracks, surrounded by people who had chosen military service as their path toward better lives rather than an escape from privileged boredom, he wasn't sure anymore. "I don't know," Morrison said finally. "I'm starting to think maybe this is the first real choice I've ever made. Everything else in my life was decided for me or given to me. This is the first thing I've had to earn." Chen smiled. "Then, you better make sure you earn it." As lights out approached, Morrison prepared for sleep with a different mindset than he had carried for weeks. Instead of resentment about military routine and regulations, he felt anticipation for the next day's challenges. Instead of plotting ways to assert his dominance over fellow recruits, he found himself looking forward to working with teammates who were becoming friends. Rodriguez made his final rounds through the barracks, checking on recruits and noting any issues that needed attention. When he passed Morrison's bunk, he saw the young man lying quietly, staring at the ceiling in apparent thought rather than the angry frustration that had marked his first weeks. The drill sergeant made a note in his mental assessment of Morrison's progress. One good day didn't fix 3 weeks of problems, but it suggested the possibility of genuine change. Rodriguez had seen recruits make this kind of turnaround before, usually the ones who were fundamentally decent people whose character had been obscured by immaturity or circumstance rather than corrupted by genuine malice. Tomorrow would bring new tests of Morrison's apparent progress. Advanced tactical training would require not just cooperation but leadership under pressure. Rodriguez would be watching carefully to see whether Morrison's improved attitude was genuine transformation or just temporary adaptation to consequences. As the barracks settled into the quiet of lights out, Morrison found his thoughts returning to Chen's question about what he was running toward rather than away from. For the first time since arriving at Fort Campbell, he was beginning to see the army not as punishment or escape, but as an opportunity to discover who he might become when his character was tested against real challenges rather than artificial obstacles his family money could overcome. The sounds of Fort Campbell at night, distant machinery, occasional voices from late-duty personnel, the constant hum of activity that marked a military installation no longer seemed foreign or hostile to Morrison. They were becoming familiar, even comforting. He was beginning to understand that belonging to something larger than himself might be exactly what he had been searching for without knowing it. The third week of Morrison's transformation began with an unexpected challenge that would test every lesson he had learned about teamwork and leadership. Rodriguez announced that the training unit would participate in a 48-hour field exercise designed to simulate real combat conditions, complete with sleep deprivation, limited resources, and constantly changing objectives. Morrison listened to the briefing with growing anxiety. Extended field exercises were exactly the kind of high-stress environment where his old habits of taking charge and making unilateral decisions had previously caused problems. But, this time, he was determined to apply the lessons he had learned about listening, cooperation, and earning rather than demanding respect. The exercise began at 0400 hours with teams loading into transport vehicles for deployment to an undisclosed location in the Kentucky wilderness. Morrison found himself assigned to a 12-person squad led by Recruit Sergeant Patricia Martinez, a former Marine who had joined the Army after 4 years of service in the Corps. Martinez was 26, older than most recruits, with combat experience in Afghanistan that gave her natural authority among her peers. Morrison had worked with Martinez briefly during previous training, but never in an extended leadership scenario. She was known for being fair but demanding, with little patience for ego or political maneuvering. If Morrison was going to prove his growth was genuine, it would be under the scrutiny of someone who could see through performance to authentic character. The squad's composition reflected Rodriguez's careful planning. Along with Morrison, Chen, Williams, and Kumar, the team included Roberts, Washington, Jones, and 4 other recruits whose skills complemented each other. Martinez would be tested on her leadership abilities, while each team member would be evaluated on how well they supported the unit's mission under stress. Their first objective was to establish a defensive perimeter around a simulated forward operating base while gathering intelligence on enemy positions in the surrounding area. The exercise would involve live ammunition during certain phases, adding real danger to the training scenario and demanding genuine tactical competence from every participant. Morrison found himself assigned as assistant team leader, a role that required him to support Martinez's decisions while helping coordinate the various specialties within their squad. It was exactly the kind of position where his previous tendency to second-guess authority and pursue personal glory could sabotage the entire unit's performance. As they disembarked from the transport vehicle and surveyed their assigned area, Martinez gathered the squad for initial planning. The terrain was challenging, heavily wooded with limited visibility, multiple elevation changes, and several potential enemy approach routes that would need constant monitoring. Martinez said after explaining the overall tactical situation. "I want you to work with Chen and Kumar to establish observation posts on the high ground. Williams and Roberts will handle defensive positions covering the main approach routes." Questions? Morrison's first instinct was to suggest modifications to Martinez's plan based on his hunting experience in similar terrain. But he caught himself, remembering lessons learned through recent failures. Instead, he asked clarifying questions to ensure he understood his role completely. "How often do you want position reports?" Morrison asked. "And what's our communication protocol if we spot potential threats?" Martinez nodded approvingly. Morrison was asking the right kinds of questions, operational details that would help him execute his assignment effectively rather than strategic challenges that might undermine her authority. "Every 30 minutes unless you see something urgent," Martinez replied. "Use hand signals when possible to maintain noise discipline. Radio only for immediate threats or if you lose visual contact with base camp." Morrison acknowledged the orders and began coordinating with Chen and Kumar to establish their observation posts. The work required careful movement through difficult terrain while maintaining concealment from potential observers. It was exactly the kind of task that rewarded patience and teamwork over individual heroics. Chen had become Morrison's most reliable partner during recent training exercises. Her medical training gave her valuable skills for field operations, while her natural caution balanced Morrison's tendency toward aggressive action. As they moved through the woods together, Morrison found himself genuinely appreciating her tactical insights. "There," Chen whispered, pointing to a rocky outcropping that offered excellent visibility while providing natural concealment. "That position gives us line of sight on 2 approach routes plus radio contact with base camp." Morrison studied the position, noting both its advantages and potential vulnerabilities. "Good spot," he agreed. "But if we get compromised there, we'll need a secondary position and an escape route. Kumar, can you identify alternatives while Chen and I set up the primary?" It was collaborative leadership, using each team member's strengths while maintaining focus on the overall mission objective. Kumar's analytical mind made him excellent at identifying backup plans and contingencies, while Chen's tactical training helped optimize their positioning for both observation and survival. The first 12 hours of the exercise passed without major incident, but Morrison could feel the stress building within their squad. Sleep deprivation was beginning to affect decision-making, and the constant vigilance required for defensive operations was mentally exhausting. This was exactly the kind of environment where individual weaknesses became magnified and team cohesion either strengthened or collapsed. Martinez rotated personnel through different positions to maintain alertness, and Morrison found himself paired with Williams for a 4-hour shift covering one of the main approach routes. Williams had been openly skeptical of Morrison's character transformation, so working closely together would be a significant test of whether Morrison's improved behavior was genuine or just temporary adaptation. "Morrison," Williams said quietly as they settled into their defensive position. "I got to ask you something, and I want a straight answer." Morrison checked his field of fire and adjusted his position for better concealment before responding. "Shoot. You've been acting different the last couple weeks. Less like a privileged asshole, more like somebody who might actually belong here." Williams paused, scanning the tree line through his weapon sight. "My question is whether this is real or just you playing a part until you figure out how to get back to being in charge." The question hit Morrison harder than Williams probably intended. It forced him to examine his own motivations honestly, something he had been avoiding even in his private moments of self-reflection. "Honestly?" Morrison said after a long pause. "I don't know yet. I know the way I was acting before wasn't working, and I know I was making everyone's job harder, including my own. Whether this new approach sticks when things get really difficult." He shrugged. "I guess we're about to find out." Williams considered this response while maintaining his watch on potential enemy positions. "That's probably the most honest answer you could give," he said finally. "Most people would try to convince me they've completely changed forever. At least you're admitting you don't know what you'll do when you get tested." Their conversation was interrupted by movement in the distance, not enemy activity, but a deer crossing through their area of responsibility. Both men tensed momentarily before recognizing the false alarm, but the incident reminded them how easy it would be to make critical mistakes under the stress of extended operations. "Williams," Morrison said quietly, "I know I gave you plenty of reasons to think I'm unreliable. If something happens during this exercise, if things go bad, you can count on me to do my job. I'm not going to let ego or stupidity put you or anyone else at risk." Williams looked at Morrison carefully, searching for signs of insincerity or calculation. What he saw was nervous determination. Morrison was scared of failing his teammates, which was exactly the right kind of fear for a soldier to have. "All right," Williams said. "But if you revert back to being an arrogant jackass when this is over, I'm going to personally make sure Rodriguez knows about it." Morrison almost smiled. "Fair enough." The second day of the exercise brought escalating challenges as Rodriguez introduced unexpected complications designed to test the squad's adaptability and resilience. Enemy contact scenarios required split-second decisions about engagement rules and civilian safety. Equipment failures forced improvisation with limited resources. Casualty simulations tested medical procedures and evacuation protocols under fire. Morrison found himself repeatedly thrust into situations where his natural instincts conflicted with proper tactical procedure. When their squad encountered a simulated civilian casualty during a patrol mission, his first impulse was to rush forward and take charge of the medical response. But Chen was the designated medic, and Morrison's role was to provide security while she worked. Watching Chen work efficiently to stabilize the simulated casualty while under time pressure, Morrison realized how much more effective the team was when everyone stayed in their assigned roles rather than trying to do everything themselves. His job was to ensure Chen could focus on her medical tasks without worrying about security threats, not to take over her responsibilities because he wanted to be the hero. Morrison, Chen called out as she worked. I need you to establish communications with base camp for medical evacuation. Give them our coordinates, casualty status, and requesting immediate helicopter support. Morrison executed the communication protocol exactly as they had been trained, providing clear and concise information that would allow command to make appropriate decisions about resource allocation. It was routine work, but performing it competently under stress was exactly what separated effective soldiers from individuals who happened to wear uniforms. The medical evacuation scenario was followed by an enemy contact simulation that tested the squad's ability to maneuver under fire while maintaining unit cohesion. Martinez had to coordinate movement across difficult terrain while Morrison helped manage the tactical details that kept everyone positioned correctly relative to each other and their objectives. Contact left, 200 meters, Martinez called out as the exercise began. Morrison, take Roberts and Jones around the right flank. Chen and Kumar provide suppressing fire from current position. Move in 30 seconds on my mark. Morrison acknowledged the order and quickly briefed Roberts and Jones on their movement route and objective. The flanking maneuver required careful coordination with the base teams suppressing fire, precise timing to avoid exposing themselves to enemy observation, and constant communication to adapt to changing conditions. As they moved through the woods, Morrison found himself drawing on every lesson he had learned about teamwork and tactical thinking. Roberts's experience with heavy machinery gave him excellent instincts for moving quietly through difficult terrain. Jones's farm background made him naturally skilled at reading ground conditions and identifying safe routes. Instead of trying to impose his own plan on the team, Morrison coordinated their individual strengths into collective effectiveness. When Roberts identified a better approach route, Morrison adjusted their movement accordingly. When Jones spotted potential enemy positions that weren't visible from their original angle, Morrison relayed the intelligence back to Martinez for tactical decision-making. The flanking maneuver succeeded because each team member contributed their specialized knowledge while maintaining focus on the overall mission objective. Morrison had learned to be the conductor rather than trying to play every instrument himself, allowing the team to perform far better than any individual could achieve alone. As the 48-hour exercise concluded, Rodriguez gathered the entire training unit for comprehensive debriefing. Unlike the individual criticism sessions that had marked Morrison's early weeks, this review focused on unit performance, lessons learned, and areas for continued development. Martinez's squad showed significant improvement in tactical coordination and adaptability under stress, Rodriguez announced to the assembled recruits. Individual performances were generally strong, with notable progress in leadership development and team cohesion. Morrison felt cautious satisfaction at the assessment. He had contributed positively to his squad's performance, but, more importantly, he had done so without creating the kind of interpersonal conflicts that had marked his previous training exercises. Rodriguez continued with individual observations that would guide each recruit's remaining training progression. When he reached Morrison, his assessment was measured but encouraging. Morrison has demonstrated significant progress in understanding the difference between leadership and dominance, Rodriguez said. His technical skills are solid, and his tactical thinking is developing appropriately. Continued focus on supporting team objectives rather than seeking individual recognition will determine his success in advanced training phases. It was qualified praise, but Morrison recognized it as far more than he had earned during his first weeks at Fort Campbell. Rodriguez was acknowledging genuine improvement while making clear that sustained performance would be required to complete his transformation from problematic recruit to effective soldier. After the debriefing, Morrison found himself surrounded by squad members who had become genuine friends rather than simply fellow recruits he had to tolerate. The shared experience of the field exercise had created bonds that went beyond the superficial camaraderie of basic training. Morrison, Martinez said as they prepared to return to normal barracks routine. "You did good work out there. You figured out how to be an asset to your team instead of a liability. Keep that up, and you'll make a solid soldier." The assessment meant more to Morrison than any praise he had received in his privileged civilian life. Martinez had earned the right to judge his performance through her own demonstrated competence and leadership. Her approval was based on measurable contribution to unit effectiveness rather than social connections or family status. Chen joined them as they walked back toward the barracks. "So," she said with a slight smile, "still think you know everything there is to know about leadership?" Morrison laughed, genuinely amused by the question. "I'm starting to think everything I thought I knew about leadership was completely wrong. Turns out actually leading people is a lot harder than just telling them what to do. And a lot more satisfying when you get it right," Chen observed. Morrison nodded thoughtfully. The field exercise had given him something he had never experienced before, the deep satisfaction that came from contributing meaningfully to a team's success rather than simply dominating individuals through superior resources or social position. It was addictive in the best possible way. Williams approached their group, his usual skeptical expression replaced by something approaching acceptance. "Morrison," he said, "I got to admit, you proved me wrong out there. You actually pulled your weight instead of trying to take over everyone else's job." "Thanks," Morrison said. "That means a lot coming from you. I know I gave you plenty of reasons to write me off." "Yeah, you did," Williams agreed. "But you also gave me reasons to reconsider. That's more than most people manage when they screw up as bad as you did." As they entered the barracks, Morrison realized he was looking forward to the remaining weeks of basic training rather than counting down days until he could leave. The Army was challenging him in ways that civilian life never had, forcing him to develop capabilities and character traits that he was beginning to value more than the privileges he had taken for granted. Rodriguez observed these interactions from a distance, noting the genuine camaraderie that had developed around Morrison. The recruit's transformation wasn't complete. Real character change required sustained demonstration over time, but the foundation was solid. Morrison had learned the fundamental lesson that effective soldiers were made through service to others rather than dominance over them. That evening, as Morrison prepared for what had become a comfortable routine of evening maintenance and informal conversation with his fellow recruits, he reflected on how much his perspective had changed since arriving at Fort Campbell. The person who had stepped off the bus 6 weeks earlier, arrogant, entitled, convinced of his own superiority, seemed like a stranger now. He wasn't sure yet who he was becoming, but he knew he liked this version of himself better than the one he had been. The Army was giving him the opportunity to discover his authentic character rather than simply playing roles that his family wealth and social connections had made available. It was the first real choice he had ever made, and he was determined to prove worthy of the opportunity. The final phase of basic training brought challenges that would have broken the Morrison who first arrived at Fort Campbell, but the man he had become faced them with quiet determination and hard-earned wisdom about the difference between strength and stubbornness. Rodriguez watched his transformation with professional satisfaction, knowing that genuine character change was rare and valuable in ways that couldn't be taught through standard training protocols. The crisis that would define Morrison's legacy at Fort Campbell began during what should have been a routine night navigation exercise. Advanced recruits were working in pairs to navigate through difficult terrain using only compass and map, developing the fundamental skills that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure in real combat operations. Morrison had been paired with Private Daniel Torres, a quiet recruit from El Paso who had struggled with some of the physical demands of training but excelled in technical subjects like communications and navigation. Torres was methodical and careful, qualities that made him an excellent navigator but sometimes led to slower decision-making under pressure. The night was particularly dark, with heavy cloud cover blocking most starlight and a steady drizzle that made maps difficult to read and terrain treacherous to navigate. Morrison and Torres were working their way through a series of checkpoints that would test their ability to maintain direction and pace over several miles of challenging Kentucky wilderness. They had successfully reached their first two objectives ahead of schedule when Torres suddenly stumbled and fell heavily to the ground. Morrison immediately dropped beside his partner, conducting the rapid assessment procedures they had been trained to perform when teammates were injured. Torres was conscious but clearly in significant pain. His left ankle was already beginning to swell, and he couldn't put weight on it without grimacing. In the darkness and isolation of the training area, Morrison realized they were facing exactly the kind of emergency that separated theoretical knowledge from practical competence. "I think it's broken," Torres whispered, trying to keep his voice low to maintain the noise discipline required for the exercise. "I can't walk on it." Morrison's mind raced through their options. They were approximately 2 miles from the nearest extraction point, in terrain that would be difficult for a rescue team to navigate quickly. Torres needed medical attention, but their radio communication was limited to emergency frequencies that would immediately terminate their training exercise. The old Morrison would have made an immediate decision based on his own assessment of the situation, probably calling for emergency extraction without fully considering alternatives or consulting with his injured partner. But months of hard-learned lessons about teamwork and leadership had taught him to think differently about crisis response. "Torres," Morrison said quietly, "talk to me about your assessment of the injury. Is this something you think you could manage with field treatment, or do you need immediate medical evacuation?" Torres was quiet for a moment, clearly in pain but thinking seriously about the question. "It might be a bad sprain rather than a break," he said finally. "If we can improvise some support, I might be able to make it to the next checkpoint where the terrain is easier for extraction." Morrison considered this carefully. Moving an injured soldier always involved risk, but so did extended exposure to cold and wet conditions while waiting for rescue. His navigation training had shown him that the next checkpoint was only about half a mile away and involved much easier terrain for emergency vehicles. "Here's what we're going to do," Morrison said after thinking through their options. "I'm going to use our emergency medical supplies to stabilize your ankle as much as possible. Then, we'll move slowly toward checkpoint 3, where you'll have better shelter while I call for medical support. If your pain gets worse or you can't continue, we call for immediate extraction. Your call to stop at any time, no questions asked." Torres nodded agreement, and Morrison began applying the field first aid techniques they had been trained to use for potential fractures. He used their emergency splinting materials to immobilize Torres's ankle and administered the basic pain medication from their first aid kit. The process took nearly 30 minutes, during which Morrison had to balance speed with thoroughness while maintaining constant communication with Torres about his condition and comfort level. It was exactly the kind of situation where panic or poor decision-making could turn a manageable injury into a life-threatening emergency. "Ready to try moving?" Morrison asked after completing his field treatment. Torres tested his ability to bear weight carefully, using Morrison's shoulder for support. The improvised treatment had helped significantly, and he was able to move slowly with assistance. "Yeah," Torres said. "Let's try it." The journey to checkpoint 3 took nearly 2 hours, with frequent stops to rest and reassess Torres's condition. Morrison found himself drawing on every lesson he had learned about patience, teamwork, and putting mission success ahead of personal glory. Moving slowly with an injured partner was frustrating for someone with his natural urgency, but he recognized that getting Torres to safety was more important than completing the exercise quickly. More importantly, Morrison realized he was enjoying the challenge of taking care of his teammate rather than simply completing his own training objectives. The satisfaction of helping Torres manage his injury and maintain his dignity during a difficult situation was deeper than any individual achievement he had previously experienced. When they finally reached checkpoint 3, Morrison immediately called for medical evacuation while helping Torres find a comfortable position to wait for the rescue team. The checkpoint offered better shelter from the weather and clear access for emergency vehicles, making the decision to continue rather than calling for immediate extraction clearly correct. "Morrison," Torres said as they waited for the medical team to arrive. "Thanks for not just calling for immediate evacuation back there. I know it would have been easier and safer for you." Morrison was surprised by the comment. "What do you mean safer for me?" You could have gotten in trouble if I got hurt worse while we were moving, Torres explained. Making the decision to continue was taking responsibility for my safety, not just your own training performance. The observation struck Morrison powerfully because it highlighted something he hadn't fully recognized about his own development. He had made decisions based on what was best for Torres and their team rather than what would minimize his own risk or maximize his own success. It was a fundamental shift from the self-centered thinking that had characterized his first weeks of training. Rodriguez arrived with the medical team and immediately began assessing the situation. His evaluation was professional and thorough, covering not just Torres's injury but Morrison's decision-making process and field treatment procedures. Morrison, Rodriguez said after the medics had loaded Torres into their vehicle for transport to the base medical facility. Walk me through your assessment and decision-making process. Morrison explained his reasoning clearly and completely, including his consultation with Torres about treatment options and his criteria for continuing versus calling immediate evacuation. Rodriguez listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific procedures or timing. You made good decisions under pressure, Rodriguez said finally. Your field treatment was correct, your movement plan was sound, and you maintained appropriate communication with your partner throughout the process. Most importantly, you kept Torres's welfare as your primary consideration rather than trying to minimize your own risk or complete the exercise for personal credit. The assessment was exactly what Morrison had hoped to hear, but Rodriguez continued with observations that challenged him to think more deeply about leadership under stress. The easy choice would have been immediate evacuation, Rodriguez said. That would have guaranteed Torres got medical attention quickly and minimized any risk of criticism if something went wrong. But sometimes leadership requires accepting personal risk to achieve better outcomes for your team. Morrison nodded thoughtfully. I realize now that I was more concerned about doing right by Torres than I was about protecting myself from potential criticism. That's different from how I used to think about difficult decisions. Rodriguez smiled slightly. That's exactly the kind of thinking that separates effective leaders from people who just hold leadership positions. When your primary concern is serving your team rather than protecting your own position, you make different kinds of decisions. The conversation was interrupted by a radio call informing them that Torres had been examined at the base medical facility. His ankle was severely sprained but not broken, and he would be able to return to training after a few days of rest and rehabilitation. Morrison's field treatment and decision to continue to better extraction point had been exactly correct. Torres wants to thank you personally when he gets back, Rodriguez told Morrison. He said you took care of him like he was family rather than just another recruit. Morrison felt a warmth that had nothing to do with physical comfort. Taking care of Torres hadn't felt like duty or obligation, it had felt natural and right in a way that his previous competitive achievements never had. The remaining days of basic training passed quickly, with Morrison participating in final evaluations that would determine his assignment for advanced training. His technical scores were solid, his physical fitness was excellent, and his leadership evaluations reflected the dramatic transformation he had undergone since his first difficult weeks. More importantly to Morrison, he had earned the genuine respect of his fellow recruits and the professional approval of his instructors. When Torres returned from medical leave, his quiet thanks and obvious gratitude meant more to Morrison than any formal recognition he had ever received. The graduation ceremony for their training class took place on a crisp Kentucky morning with families gathered to witness their sons and daughters complete the transformation from civilian to soldier. Morrison's parents had flown in from Connecticut, their presence a reminder of the life he had chosen to leave behind. Standing in formation with his fellow graduates, Morrison reflected on how fundamentally he had changed since arriving at Fort Campbell. The angry, entitled young man who had stepped off the bus months earlier had been replaced by someone he genuinely liked and respected, a soldier who understood that strength came through service to others rather than dominance over them. Rodriguez addressed the graduating class with words that would stay with Morrison long after he left basic training for his next assignment. You came here as individuals with different backgrounds, different motivations, and different levels of preparedness for military service, Rodriguez said. You're leaving as soldiers who understand that your individual success depends entirely on your commitment to your teammates and your mission. His eyes found Morrison in the formation. Some of you discovered capabilities you didn't know you possessed. Others learned that character is more important than talent. All of you learned that becoming a soldier requires choosing to serve something larger than yourself. After the ceremony, Morrison's parents approached with expressions that mixed pride with confusion. They had expected their son's military service to be a temporary rebellion that would ultimately reinforce his appreciation for civilian privileges. Instead, they found a young man who had discovered authentic purpose through service and sacrifice. "Jake," his father said uncertainly, "you seem different. More mature, I suppose." Morrison considered how to explain his transformation to people who had never experienced the satisfaction of earning respect through competence rather than receiving deference through social position. "I found out who I actually am when everything I took for granted was taken away," Morrison said. "Turns out I like this version of myself better than the one I was before." His mother looked concerned. "But, surely you're planning to come home after your service commitment is complete?" "The family business will need a mom," Morrison interrupted gently. "I've found something here that I never had at home. I'm not sure I want to give that up for a predetermined life that was never really mine to choose." Rodriguez observed this family interaction from a distance, recognizing the tension between Morrison's growth and his family's expectations. It was a common challenge for recruits who discovered authentic identity through military service, learning to maintain their new character while navigating relationships that had been built around their previous limitations. Chen, Williams, Kumar, and several other members of Morrison's training class gathered around him after his family conversation concluded. They had become genuine friends through shared challenges and mutual support, creating bonds that would last long beyond their basic training experience. "So Morrison," Williams said with a grin, "you still think you know everything there is to know about being tough?" Morrison laughed, remembering his arrogant assumptions from months earlier. "I've learned that being tough means taking care of your teammates, following orders from people who know better than you do, and admitting when you need help. Turns out that's a lot harder than just talking big and throwing money at problems." Chen smiled. "And a lot more satisfying when you get it right." "Yeah," Morrison agreed, looking around at the friends who had helped him discover his authentic character. "A lot more satisfying." As the graduation celebration continued around them, Morrison realized he was looking forward to advanced training and eventual deployment rather than counting down time until he could return to civilian life. The Army had given him something his privileged background never could: the opportunity to earn his place through service rather than inherit it through circumstance. Rodriguez approached their group one final time as the ceremony began to wind down. "You've all got your assignments for advanced training," he said. "Morrison, you're headed to Fort Benning for airborne training, then leadership development course. Don't let success go to your head again." Morrison grinned. "Roger that, drill sergeant. I think I've learned my lesson about the difference between being in charge and being worth following." Rodriguez nodded approvingly. "See that you remember it. The Army needs leaders who understand that their job is serving their soldiers, not the other way around." As Morrison prepared to leave Fort Campbell for the next phase of his military career, he carried with him lessons that had transformed not just his approach to leadership but his understanding of what it meant to live with purpose and integrity. The entitled young man who had arrived months earlier seeking escape from family expectations had become a soldier committed to serving something larger than himself. Looking back at the training grounds where he had learned these lessons, Morrison felt profound gratitude for the drill sergeants, fellow recruits, and challenging experiences that had helped him discover his authentic character. He was no longer running away from his previous life, he was running toward a future he had earned through service, sacrifice, and the hard-won respect of people whose opinion actually mattered. The collar yanking incident that had initially frozen his unit in shock had become the catalyst for transformation that neither Morrison nor Rodriguez could have predicted. Sometimes breaking down completely was necessary before genuine rebuilding could begin, and sometimes the most unlikely recruits became the most valuable soldiers when they finally learned what they were truly capable of becoming.